After I paid for the trip, my son texted, "You won't be joining us. My wife wants only family." I read it twice, 3 times. The light from my phone turned the kitchen into a small stage. The clock ticked like a metronome I hadn't noticed before. "Okay," I typed, because that's what I always typed when the world asked me to be smaller. My thumbs hovered, then stopped. The word felt like a thin bandage over a larger wound. In the quiet after the message, memories unfolded the way rooms reveal themselves once the lights go on. I saw the curtains I'd sewn with my own hands for their bedroom, yellow fabric I'd chosen because Melanie said it made the mornings brighter. I could smell the detergent from the time I'd washed every throw pillow before their housewarming. I saw the plaster dust on my cardigan from the week I paid for the contractor to fix the front stoop, so no one would trip. I saw the receipts folded inside an envelope in my drawer, neat rows of little kindnesses that had become the ledger of my life with them. I didn't know where the line was crossed. I had thought of those things as gifts, practical, straightforward, given without a ledger in mind. That's what love looks like when you've been mothering for decades, an unremarked pattern of doing and covering and smoothing. Being useful had become my default identity. I kept the coffee hot when they arrived late. I took dinners over the nights they had a newborn. I lent money without asking for notes. I liked being useful. I liked the soft reverence in David's thank you hugs when he was small, and the quick, guilty smiles as an adult when I handed him an envelope. Then the text. It reframed everything. A single line turned the whole history of favors into a set of transactions where I'd apparently been the one investing, and they the ones compounding. It's a strange thing to have your motives laid bare by someone who never asked about them. The hurt was not the text alone. It was the recognition that the warmth I'd felt could be counted and then discounted. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to hear other real-life stories about reclaiming your life. I called Nancy because there are some truths only a lifelong friend can hold without flinching. She arrived with her usual thermos and a stare that was calm and immediate. "You're not a charity," she said, not unkindly, as if she were reminding me of the worn Bible line we'd both learned in different ways. It was the kind of statement that makes you look at your hands and then, slowly, at the room. We sat at the kitchen table and I told her everything that mattered and nothing that didn't. The curtains, the plaster, the house I'd helped them buy years ago because their credit was thin and I had savings. I told her the text, the way David had chosen the phrasing as if an exclusion could be polite. She listened and then folded the napkin she'd brought into a small, precise square. "You deserve to be family," she said, "not a bank account." That night, I made myself a cup of tea and opened my files. The apartment felt different at 3 a.m. The city was asleep, but my memory wasn't. There is a kind of reckoning that waits until the house is quiet enough for shame to speak. I pulled out the envelopes with the receipts, the bank statements I'd never thoroughly read because I trusted the people close to me. I started at the bottom of the list and worked up. Small transfers caught my eye first, labels that seemed ordinary. Property maintenance, supplies, home goods. They were like footnotes at the edge of a long, slow story. Each one by itself might never have mattered, but together they made a path. The money had moved in ways I hadn't authorized. There were signatures where my own should have been. There were account access notes naming someone I barely recognized in that context. A line marked that someone, Melanie, had been added as a secondary account user. I remember holding the paper until my fingers went numb. The house smelled like lemon furniture polish and the old oak table I had bought when I was first married. I felt, for the first time, the disquieting clarity of being used as a resource rather than treated as a person. The envelope slid under my door. The next morning was the thing that made the room tilt. I found it like a loose tooth, small, obvious, and impossible to ignore. Inside, a document that read, in legal language, irrevocable power of attorney. The word irrevocable felt like a cliff edge. It meant decisions could be made without needing to ask me again. Someone had prepared it, and according to what I could see, intended to make it binding. There is a moment in grief and in betrayal where you can either let the river carry you, or you can step out of it and examine the banks. I called Mr. Harris the next day. I'd spoken with him before, years earlier, about wills and taxes, quiet, boring things you do to be responsible. He picked up, as he always did, with the voice of a man who had learned to hold other people's emergencies at a distance without making them his own. "I need you to look at some documents," I told him. My voice surprised me. It sounded like someone else's plan. "Bring them in," he said. "Tell me everything you've found." Nancy sat with me in his office. Mr. Harris steepled his fingers and listened. When I slid the bank statements across the desk, his face did not change the way a judge's face doesn't change. That steadiness was useful. He said words like initiated and filed in a calm way that made me realize I was already moving without knowing I was. We hired a private investigator, quietly. He came with worn shoes and an economy-size cup of coffee. He treated paperwork the way some people treat bones. He knew which parts would tell the story. He compared signatures and called the bank. He ran a search on the added account user. He traced small transfers that, on the surface, could be explained away as household expenses, but, when lined up in sequence, showed a pattern of siphoning funds and permissions being granted without my explicit, informed consent. What came to light was not a neat crime scene with one glaringly obvious perpetrator. It was a layered thing. Transfers labeled the way an ordinary household might label them. A secondary user added for convenience. A power of attorney drafted and slipped into an envelope when I was recovering from the flu and not checking my mail. The investigator noted inconsistencies in handwriting, dates that didn't match other records, and a series of small withdrawals that, combined, represented real money taken from my accounts. Mr. Harris put everything together into a clear set of actions. We filed a request to freeze certain accounts, an immediate, temporary measure to stop further movement. He initiated a filing to reverse or challenge the deed arrangements as they had been altered. He opened the path to civil claims regarding unauthorized transfers and the contested power of attorney. I watched him write the words down and felt my heartbeat settle into a rhythm that matched the pen. There were nights I lay awake, thinking of David as a child who'd scraped his knee and come to me with trust. I thought of the man who had hugged me at his wedding and said, "We couldn't have done this without you." I didn't want to believe he could be complicit. I didn't want to think he would let his partner cross a line like this. But the evidence, when you collect it like shells on a shore, doesn't care for the shape of your nostalgia. It simply accumulates. I rehearsed how I wanted the conversation to go, and then threw the rehearsal away. Plans feel inadequate against a living person carrying a mixture of denial, anger, and embarrassing rationalizations. When people are cornered, they scramble for stories that will justify them. I wanted no stories, only the facts, folded plainly on the kitchen table. They returned from the cruise on a Tuesday. I had wanted to be there. Part of me expected spectacle. Part of me wanted only a quiet, civil explanation. The driveway was where it happened. I was standing behind the hydrangea bush, not because I was hiding, but because the sight of them stepping from the car felt like a scene I needed to watch from a safe distance. A moving van was already in the driveway, an anonymous white rectangle with the words of a company printed on its side. Men were carrying boxes that smelled faintly of detergent and new carpet. The realtor, who had been the one to sign off on parts of the house paperwork, hovered at the edge of the lawn, face a mix of awkwardness and professional detachment. I could see Melanie first, her hair tied up, sunglasses, a laugh already forming in the corner of her mouth. David walked beside her, his arm around her waist as if distance were a physical thing he could erase with a touch. I had the folder under my arm. It was thick, bank statements with lines highlighted, the printed copy of the irrevocable power of attorney, emails I'd printed out where requests had been made, the investigator's report with the observations about handwriting and timing. I had not wanted the spectacle, but when they saw me standing there, calm and deliberate, the movement in their faces changed. Melanie's smile faltered. She tried to keep it smooth. "What are you doing here, Mom?" "I'm here to talk," I said. My voice was steady. The word Mom hung in the air, a small accusation and a large longing at once. I placed the folder on the hood of the car and opened it. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse with theatricality. I simply showed the threads, the highlighted transfers, the dates. "This is money that left my accounts, labeled as household expenses. You were added as an account user. This document, an irrevocable power of attorney, appears to have been prepared without my full consent." Melanie's face reddened. David's eyes searched mine like someone looking for a map that would show him how to undo the mistake. He said her name, soft, as if to remind me she was his. Melanie's voice sharpened. She said things I remember only in fragments. We needed to be practical. You weren't checking things. I was just helping. Helping. The word landed differently depending on who spoke it. In my mouth, it had meant a shared labor, a reciprocity. In theirs, it had been a convenience that, over time, had been treated as entitlement. They tried to explain. David's explanation was not a capitulation. It was a plea. "Mom, we never meant," he began. His hands waved as if he could fan the incriminating pages into nothing. "Melanie accused me of dramatizing. She accused me of misunderstanding. She brought up little things, a late payment here, a miscommunication there. She called the investigator's report biased. She wanted control of the narrative. It's what people do when the structural advantage starts to crumble. I let them speak. I let David reach for the narrative that protected him. I let Melanie find the words that rationalized her choices. Then I said the thing I had written in my head so many times I thought it might be sentimental. I was your mother. You made me your target. The phrase landed like a stone. Silence did something I could not force. The moving men stopped carrying boxes. The realtor backed away slightly. For a moment there was only the sound of distant traffic and a bird that had decided to join the day. What followed was not a courtroom. It was not a dramatic confession. It was small, human, messy. Melanie's defense rose into anger. She turned the finger back at me, at reasons, at perceived neglect. David's face crumpled in places and tightened in others. I watched both of them like a witness to their own choices. I handed them copies of the investigator's report and the highlighted statements. I explained, simply, without legal instruction, that my attorney had filed for specific remedies and that certain accounts had been temporarily restricted while the matter was reviewed. I did not gloat. I did not promise what the courts might decide. I said only what had happened. I filed. I asked questions. I stopped more money from moving while we find out what was done. There is a peculiar dignity in naming the reality you are living. It does not undo the past, but it refuses the erasure. I felt something unspool inside me, the old reflex to apologize for existing, to minimize, to accommodate. That reflex had been a comfortable garment I had worn for decades. When I removed it, my shoulders felt strange and new. They left some of the boxes. The moving men finished their route, the van pulled away, and the driveway was suddenly ordinary again. The realtor lingered with a look that said he had been moved into the role of accidental witness. He offered to talk privately later about paperwork. I declined. There was nothing more to say to people who would not first acknowledge what they had done. In the days that followed, there were phone calls, some angry, some pleading. David left messages that read like a person both guilty and frightened of losing what he had always assumed was guaranteed. Melanie texted things that were sharp, and then later, softer, then sharp again. I read them, and then put the phone down, because the device had been one way they had kept distance. It had been how the text arrived that told me everything I needed to know. I moved, not in a single dramatic sweep, but in the slow, steady way that aging things are blessed and cursed by, the physicality of packing, the kindnesses of friends. Nancy helped. She is steady in a way that is practical and emotional at once. She brought boxes and lemon cake and the kind of frank talk that makes you see your own story without pity or bluster. We packed the curtains I had sewn, some things I could not bear to leave behind, and other things that were merely familiar. My new place is modest. It has a small balcony that faces a courtyard where neighbors water succulents. It has a kitchen that fits my table like a hand in a glove. There is less space to hide in, and oddly, that is liberating. My days are measured by quiet routines, making tea, reading, meeting a neighbor in the hall. I buy my groceries and carry them up the stairs myself. It's a small exercise in reclaiming muscle and trust. Friends asked if I felt triumphant. I did not. That would be a story of winning. What I felt was clearer, relief, and a strange, unanticipated joy. Without the worn-out habit of invisibly serving everyone else, I discovered small freedoms. I read a book uninterrupted. I sat in sunlight on my balcony at noon. I learned how to listen to myself for longer than it takes to prepare a casserole. The legal matters remain a process. I do not tell you this to make a point about justice. Courts have their own timelines. I tell you this because you should know how ordinary it feels to have your life re-examined and to keep on living. I filed, yes. The lawyer initiated steps. The investigator delivered observations that made courtroom questions possible. But the real work was in not letting the betrayal write the ending for me. There were moments in the first weeks when I caught myself composing the apology I would give if they returned contrite. I realized with a small, uncomfortable laugh that apologies asked for are often less about remorse and more about reestablishing comfort. I stopped composing the apology. I stopped imagining the scene in which I would forgive them on someone else's terms. I started composing a life that did not require their validation. People have asked me if I regret helping them over the years. The answer is complicated. I do not regret the tangible kindnesses, the plaster dust on my cardigan, the hand-stitched curtains, the dinners when their children were too small to feed themselves. Those were acts of love. The regret is for not seeing sooner how those acts had been folded into a ledger that counted me only as a resource. I regret the time I stayed quiet when small displacements accumulated into a structure that allowed them to assume authority over my affairs. I learned the difference between being generous and being invisible. Generosity is a gift given freely. Invisibility is a role assigned by others. Reclaiming my life meant stepping out of that assigned role. It meant asking uncomfortable questions. It meant showing evidence and refusing to be shamed into silence. It meant that, at the end, I could sleep at night without the heavy cushion of accommodating everyone else. The last time I drove by their street, the house looked smaller in the afternoon light. I did not stop. I did not need to. There is a strange peace that comes when you stop trying to manage other people's moral shape. I am not free from sorrow. There are mornings when the ache returns, the small, tender spots that used to belong to a mother's private optimism. But those mornings are tempered by a steady backbone that did not exist before. If you've read this and felt a resistance in your chest, an echo of old habits that have told you to be less than you are, remember, this is not a lecture. It is a witness. The pattern of being useful until usefulness expires is common. The remedy is not to stop being kind. It is to recognize what kindness should look like when it honors both giver and receiver. I do not have a triumphant final chapter to offer. The legal path is ongoing. I do not promise that every step I took will result in the tidy justice that makes for heroic endings. I only know what I did. I noticed, I gathered the evidence that was there in small telling pieces, and I acted. I hired help. I stopped transfers. I filed the documents that would let authorities look into what had been done while I was vulnerable. I confronted them with what I had found. And then I walked away. Walking away was not defeat, it was boundary. It was the first day of a life where my presence was not predominantly transactional. It was, finally, refusal of being someone's resource masked as family. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that boundaries are not betrayal. Comment below if you've ever had to reclaim a piece of yourself. You're not alone. The last thing I want to say is the simplest. I am not erased. I am present and accounted for in ways that matter. The curtains are still on my windows. The coffee still grows warm in the morning light. The ledger of my life no longer belongs to someone else's counting. I am learning how to be generous without losing myself. I am learning, finally, that being family does not mean being invisible.